Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Recently, it seems like California's been on fire all the time. 13 of the last 20 fires, the most destructive fires, that's 2/3, have occurred just since 2017. So maybe that's why we feel that way. What can be done to reduce wildfires and their impact, particularly on homes, people who live nearby? A recent report was published by the non-partisan legislative analyst on that very topic, and we're fortunate to have the guest on this program today, the author of that report, Helen Kerstein. She is a policy analyst specializing in forest management and fire protection with the non-partisan Legislative Analyst Office. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you so much for having me.
So listen, first, can you give us the state of wildfires in California? I mean, is it as bad as it seems?
It's been really bad. It's kind of, I think seems bad to all of us because it actually has been. So for example, 5 of the 20 most destructive wildfires in the state's recorded history happened in 1 year in 2020 alone. And as you mentioned, 13 of the 20 most destructive wildfires have occurred just in roughly the last 5 years. So that's really dramatic. We've had a lot of very destructive wildfires. They've done pretty immense amounts of damage in the state. So those 13 most destructive wildfires that I mentioned, they destroyed roughly 40,000 structures. They took close to 150 lives. They caused smoke that I think all of us experienced in California, smoke that not just affected the vicinity of the fires, but affected the whole state and the whole region. So there was wildfire smoke from California that was going all across the country, right? And it was hard to even go outside. We saw these sort of, orange skies. And
that's very true. I mean, down in San Diego, you're smelling fires, forest fires are happening elsewhere in the state. Why is California so prone to wildfires?
I think that's a really important question. So California is just naturally prone to wildfires. I think that's something sometimes we forget. A lot of that's just due to our climate. So again, if you lived in California for probably any extended period of time, you realize that we get seasonal rainfall, right? So usually most of the rainfall we have, it falls in late fall, it falls in the winter. Starting in the spring, the state really starts to dry out and it gets hotter, and that makes it really more prone to wildfires in those times of the year. And wildfires are really natural in the state. I think we think of them as sort of this unnatural thing that that affects us and shouldn't be happening. But in fact, it's very natural to have wildfires on the landscape here in California. Historically, a lot of the state would burn every year. So I think one of the things we sort of lose perspective on is how much would burn. It was really striking to me that 2020, the year I mentioned, that was one of the most destructive wildfire years in state history. Super, super bad fire year. That year, 4.3 million acres burned, which is a lot. But scientists tell us that's probably about the amount that burned back in the 1700s before we started excluding wildfires from the landscape, before we started just putting them all out, right?
Well, that kind of begs the question, why are wildfires worse in California now?
So, I think there are probably a few different reasons. There are 3 that we highlighted in the report. One of them is climate change, right? And we've seen climate change affect a lot of aspects of the state, but certainly wildfires is one of them. And partly that's because climate change is contributing to hotter weather, to these longer dry seasons. And the dry seasons are really the time when we tend to have the worst wildfires. So increases the length of that wildfire season and those wildfire risks. It also leads to longer, more severe droughts. And that's bad because it can put stress on trees. It can make them more vulnerable to pest infestations. And once you have dead and dying trees, that creates more fuel for wildfires. So that's certainly one contributor. Another contributor is the poor forest and land management practices. And part of that is probably that we've basically been excluding kind of good wildfire from the landscape. And previously, sort of historically, these fires would play a really important role in the state. They would get rid of some of the sort of vegetation that was the brush, and they would allow forests to grow in healthy ways with a lot of these natural and native species really evolved to expect that wildfire. So when we excluded them, that was another thing. And then I think the third thing I want to highlight is that we've also developed more in areas that are intermixed with
the interface. Yeah, and I want to ask you about that. There's this idea called defensible space, that if you clear the brush away from a house, that somehow that's supposed to mitigate the intensity of the damage, the amount of the damage. How much space are we talking about? And by the way, besides the homeowner, who else should care?
Yeah, I think those are really good questions. So defensible space is that area around your house, right, where you try to not have a lot of dead and dying vegetation. You try not to have things that are flammable, that are going to cause fires that can then spread to your house. Usually the rule of thumb is about 100 feet. And that seems like a lot, but that's ideally what you'd have. But I think there's been a growing recognition that the most important area is right around your house. So if you have to start someplace, start around your house. Do the first 5 feet really well. Make sure there's nothing flammable in that area, and then kind of work your way outwards. So if you can get to 100 feet, great, but at least really get that first 5 feet. In terms of who should care, I think it's pretty easy to think of, it's just a homeowner responsibility. And it certainly is a homeowner responsibility. And it's important for them to protect their home, but there are a lot of impacts on the community if folks don't do this. So
one home gets caught on fire, and it impacts other people as well.
So there's a lot of information, a lot of data that suggests that wildfires spread from home to home. So if one combusts, the next one can. And then you can overwhelm firefighters. You can have a lot of destruction that can, impose costs on government that has to clean up, insurers that then have to spread it to a larger rate base. So there can be these broad impacts from wildfires that can be exacerbated when defensible space isn't maintained.
So bottom line, it's all our responsibility.
Yes, and it's what we do has impacts on not just us.
And that's true in many things, and certainly here with the defensible space and wildfires. Well, up next, we're going to talk about state and local government's actions to help create more defensible space. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Helen Kerstein, a policy analyst specializing in forest management and fire protection with the non-partisan Legislative Analyst Office, about providing more defensible space around homes that are vulnerable to forest fires. So, Helen, let me ask you this. Are there any legal requirements that require maintaining defensible space?
So there are. So because of this, we just talked about how important it is not just for the individual but for the whole community. Because of that, there are some legal requirements. So current state law requires the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection to establish requirements in both the state responsibility area, that's the area the state has primary fire protection responsibility for, as well as in very high fire hazard severity zones within the local responsibility area. And those requirements are things related to, for example, clearing dead vegetation, not having wood piles or propane tanks in certain areas. So there's certain requirements within 100 feet of a home, and then there are more stringent requirements within 30 feet. And actually starting in 2020, there was a law passed that requires that starting in 2023, there be even more stringent requirements within that first 5 feet that I mentioned, right? Most critical areas.
They're adding to those requirements. Well, how do they monitor those? How do state and local agencies monitor those?
So the main way is through inspections. So often it's, someone who comes out to the home, they look at the home, they try to assess whether it's compliant, they may conduct an enforcement action. In some cases, they may give some information and some education. Usually state and local agencies aren't required to do it. So there's variation in terms of how it works. I know that's a big theme in our report. In some, even just within CAL FIRE units, there are 27 CAL FIRE units, and there's a lot of variation in how much they're inspecting.
When I was reading your report, the CAL FIRE is supposed to inspect their parcels, a third of them every year. So get them done in 3 years, but they're actually doing about 25%, so one every 4 years. The local agencies are a little better at that. They're hitting about 35% of their parcels every year, so they're doing it about every 3 years. So CAL FIRE is a little behind on that. Let me ask you this. It's one thing to have the power to issue citations and force reimbursement. It's another to actually use it. Does CAL FIRE actually find folks, or do the local agencies do that? How often does that happen?
The short answer is not a lot. It varies by agency, right? So there's a lot of variation in their approach towards enforcement. In general, CAL FIRE usually takes more of an education approach rather than an enforcement approach. We found, for example, in the year we looked at, there were about 30,000 inspections that resulted in findings of noncompliance. Of those, fewer than 1,000 resulted in citations. So that was about maybe 3%. So most people who weren't compliant didn't get citations. CAL FIRE basically doesn't do abatement, which is where they clean up the property for you. But some local agencies do more of that, and it really varies, right? So some of them
step back for a second. So you're talking about abatement, and that is where you've talked to the homeowner, please fix this. They don't do it. So finally the state or the local comes in and says, okay, we're going to do it, and we're going to present you the bill. That doesn't happen. CAL FIRE doesn't really do that.
Yeah, CAL FIRE doesn't really do that. Some local agencies do it. It just varies, right? There are a few local agencies that use it a lot. Relatively a lot. I don't think anyone uses it a lot. It's usually a last resort, right? It tends to be very expensive and for the homeowner and not their preferred choice. So it usually is a last kind of effort. But some agencies do use it, but most don't. It's very resource intensive.
It sounds from what you're saying, there is wide variation. I mean, some do, some don't. So there's no consistency, around the state. It sounds like. Let me ask you this: in terms of homeowner education and assistance programs that are available, are there many programs that homeowners can look to kind of give them some help or some guidance on how to do this defensible space around their homes?
Yeah. So again, there's variation. Most of these programs are really administered by local agencies, by fire safe councils. They're sort of administered at the local level. In many cases, they get funded from the state. So CAL FIRE runs a grant program that often supports these programs. They sometimes get federal funding as well as local funding to support them. But usually they're administered at the local level. CAL FIRE generally doesn't directly run them, although it actually is piloting a wildfire mitigation pilot program that does provide some funding to a few select communities in the state as sort of a pilot. But generally, it's been something that has been given to grants are given to locals, and then they administer the programs.
We've only got about 15 seconds left in the segment. I did want to ask you about something called home hardening.
Yes.
Is that a tactic that's used?
It is so important. I know this segment's about defensible space. Defensible space is critical, but wildfires will find the weakest link in the home, right? And so an ember can penetrate a vent. It can start a significant fire. So really making sure that your home is protected as well, that you have screens on those vents, for example, is so critical. So we think that it's really critical to have those things paired, not just defensible space, that's very important, but also home hardening.
So there's multiple strategies. Well, up next, what can be done to increase homeowners' use of defensible space and home hardening? What strategies can be done? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Hepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Helen Kerstein, who is a policy analyst specializing in forest management and fire protection with the non-partisan Legislative Analyst Office, about providing more defensible space around homes that are vulnerable to forest fires. I want to turn our attention to whether state and local efforts are increasing, and their attempts to increase defensible space are actually effective. So your report indicates that compliance rates for defensible space are quite high, but they vary widely, as we mentioned earlier. Is that the best way to measure risk reduction?
It's probably not perfect. So again, compliance rates are overall with the CAL FIRE data, it looks like about 86% compliant. That seems pretty good. But it's hard to tell whether that, how meaningful it is in some cases. But I'll tell you, we don't have anything better at this point. So it's probably the best we have, at least at this point.
You mentioned that the reporting efforts to improve compliance are hindered due to, quote, a lack of consistent data and inspection standards. Can you explain?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is really important to understand is there are a lot of agencies involved, right? So we've got not just CAL FIRE and the contract counties, but we've got probably hundreds of local agencies with roles and responsibilities in terms of doing these inspections, in terms of doing other kinds of defensible space programs. And so, you've got all of these different agencies. And right now, we don't really have great information on exactly what's going on in terms of how many inspections they're doing. In many cases, the local agencies, what their compliance is. So we've got better information from CAL FIRE, less good or quality information from the locals. So we did a survey. That's some of the information we shared earlier is from a survey we did, but it wasn't. We didn't get everyone, right? It wasn't fully representative. So I think there's a lot of gaps there in terms of the information that's available.
So what are some of the barriers that state and local agencies face when they're trying to increase compliance with defensible space?
Yeah, so there are probably a few that we really focused on that we found in our report. One of them is just the resource intensive nature of all of this. So I mentioned the inspections, right? That often requires having someone on the ground going out, looking at each of these homes. They may not be all that close together, so there's travel time. So it's pretty resource intensive. And a lot of these agencies, especially some of these local agencies, may not have a lot of resources. They may be local fire protection districts.
One of the things I saw in your report was it's interesting that local agencies spend about, I think it was a half hour per inspection, but CAL FIRE 15 minutes. It's like drive-by.
Right. And that was kind of a little bit puzzling to me because their standard is to go out and look at the parcel. But they must not be going to the ones that are really remote, right? Because
Right.
they told me also that includes travel time. And some of these parcels really are a distance away. So I think that is a little bit, to really get at all of these properties, it does take time. It does take resources. Many of these agencies are really mostly focused on fire protection. So to have them really focus on that, I think that's one of the things that's a barrier. And also just the motivation partly, right? So,
Right.
no one likes being enforced on.
Right.
And so I think sometimes it's hard for agencies to get a lot of support to spend a lot of resources. Sometimes their general fund resources on this area.
And there's political blowback by the homeowners. They don't want to be cited and they don't want to be fined, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Fine. Let me ask you this. So there's a lot of emphasis on defensible space, but is that the most effective strategy? What about other strategies to reduce wildfire damage?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, right? Especially now, we've had all of these recent fires. The state really is focused on how do we reduce the destructiveness of fires? How much how much in terms of resources should we spend on defensible space and home hardening? We talked about home hardening versus all the other things we can do. I mean, we can do fuel breaks, we can do forest health treatments, we can do a lot of different kinds of activities. And I think one of the challenges is we don't have great information that lets us know which is the most cost effective, exactly how much money should we spend in each of these different areas.
Let me ask you this. There's only about 30 seconds left in the segment, but I want to ask you this. Where are the insurance companies in all this? It seems they have a vested interest.
They do have a vested interest, and I think there's been a lot of interest in getting them more involved. And they do, and some insurance companies do provide some discounts for the efforts that folks undertake. But it's a hard thing, right? The insurance companies have lost a lot of money over recent years in these wildfires, and it's a very complex regulatory environment. So it's a hard nut to crack. There's been some recent efforts on that. The Department of Insurance has been working with insurance companies and has some regulations that they're trying to promulgate. So we'll see. There may be more to come on that.
Yeah, the answer is we'll see. Well, up next, some recommendations on how homeowners might be encouraged to increase defensible space and better protect their homes and communities from wildfires. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Helen Kerstein, a policy analyst who specializes in forest management and fire protection with the non-partisan legislative analyst office, about what homeowners and communities can do to protect themselves from devastating wildfires. So the first thing you recommend in your report is improving data collection, sharing, and quality, including requiring public reporting of data. Why is that?
So as I mentioned, there are a lot of agencies involved, right? And we don't have great data. And we think it's really critical to get that data so we know where there are gaps in programs. So we know what really the compliance rate is in some of these areas where we don't have good information about that. We have some good information, relatively good information for CAL FIRE, but not necessarily for the locals. And so we can better assess program effectiveness. We can see, okay, if we did this new program, how does that change compliance rates? So we think better data is just critical to understanding this issue and tackling it.
A second thing you recommend in your report is to begin to address the barriers for state and local efforts. You specifically talk about lack of resources, lack of authority, lack of motivation, and you suggest more money for CAL FIRE inspectors and giving those inspectors the authority to issue fines. That may not be very popular.
Maybe not. I mean, I think we talked about, people don't like really necessarily being inspected and getting citations and those kinds of things. We think, in general, inspections, we think can be this educational opportunity. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. And hopefully homeowners would understand that this is really about trying to make them and their community safer. And then in terms of citations, there may be a role for that. We think it's good to make that something that's a more viable kind of approach. But yes, it's not always popular.
Yeah, I can imagine. So let me say, the third thing I want to talk about is third recommendation you have is the state supporting additional research efforts to identify effective strategies. It seems to make sense, right? So you specifically mentioned tying grant funding to evaluation and funding demonstration projects around the role of insurance and technology, which I thought was really interesting. But you would have thought that's what already been happening.
Yeah, it takes effort and it takes resources to do program evaluation, especially good program evaluation, right? And so there's been work in this area. I don't want to discount that there's been work on defensible space. There absolutely has been, but we think that there's room to do more, and we think additional resources can really help. And we think working it into the grant, so that the grant, the folks who are getting this money to do this type of work are collecting data that then researchers can use. We think that's another important piece of the puzzle, right? So if we have better data, we think it'll be easier for researchers to tell us some of those things that will help us make better policy decisions.
Yeah, the other thing that was interesting in that whole piece of the recommendations, you're talking about working with the Department of Insurance to develop and fund products. So this is kind of a multi-agency approach to this particular problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we talked about, insurance is a key piece, right? If you could get people to not have to be enforced, not have to get a citation, but just to want to do this, in part because they feel that immediate financial incentive of, I'll get lower insurance rates, or maybe I won't get dropped. I mean, drops. People have had big issues with getting coverage dropped. And so if this could help, that would be an important thing. And so the Department of Insurance has been very, very engaged in this. And they've been working with the insurance companies. We think that's a very promising approach. It's complicated, as I mentioned, but we think it's really promising.
Yeah, it's a way to have, you don't have to have the government necessarily involved. You create a financial incentive for the homeowners to do it themselves, and, less government regulation, let the market decide. Let me ask you this last question. You recommend a more robust oversight to apply the lessons learned already. That could really help in terms of coverage gaps and agency duplication and cost effectiveness of these defensible space strategies. It seems like the state has to be reminded to do cost assessment, cost effectiveness of the programs.
Yeah, I think again, it takes really concerted effort to collect the data, to do the evaluation. So we think it's something that's really important, especially in this area, right? Because this is such a critical issue for the state. And it's an issue that there's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of lives involved. There are a lot of, it's such a high stakes issue. So we think it's really worth putting more attention into both the program evaluation side as well as the oversight side to keep track of what agencies are doing, the data that's being collected, and make sure
it's
that
a very simple concept, right? Measure twice, cut once. I want to thank Helen Kerstein with the non-partisan legislative analyst for joining us. Thank you for joining us. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.